Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for craftworld.com. I'm Brent, and in this video, I'm going to be talking to you about casual list building for Craft Worlds. So the inspiration for this video actually comes from a comment on an earlier video that I did about competitive play. And Ira Sargent wrote something to the effect of, I would actually be interested in listening to you talk about casual list building. It's something a lot of players actually really struggle with. The more I thought about it, the more I realized Ira was right. I was wrong. I had made this flip comment in the video about how nobody needs help with casual list building, and that's not the case. Casual list building is actually very difficult, and the thing that makes it difficult is the balance you're trying to strike, right? Because on the one hand, casual list building is supposed to be for games that are not super competitive win-at-all-cost games. So you might think initially, that means I can just take my most beautiful HQ, a bunch of units that I like the look of. If I want to know whether or not something will work in the list, I just think about the fluff, right? And if striking scorpions are badass ambushers in Black Library novels, then that's what I'll have them do on the field. And it would be nice if it worked out that way, but it really doesn't, right? So if you try to build a casual list like that, you're very likely to end up with an army that has totally lost even a casual game before you start. And that's not the goal of casual play. I think the goal of casual play is for both players to show up at the table with a list that makes some narrative sense, but also the game will be decided at the table. For me, that's the hallmark element of casual play, is that both players show up intending to build lists such that who wins and who loses will depend pretty much entirely on the decisions we make while we're playing, a little bit the dice, not, who built the more optimized list before the game started. But if you build a casual list that's purely narrative, that's driven entirely by narrative concerns, it's likely to just not be competitive enough even for casual play. Similarly, if when you build your casual list, you start by hyper focusing on how you win the game, you're going to win the game, you're likely to build a list that's effective, but then maybe the other casual player doesn't have a lot of fun. And so it's really hard to strike this balance. Here's what I'm going to suggest. I'm going to walk you through how I do this. I'm going to build a thematic casual list. We'll find out what it's going to be in a minute. I'll see you at the table momentarily. But my plan is to walk you through my overall approach to this, which is to start with narrative concerns, right? So I start with an idea. Maybe it's not going to be a Wraith host, so don't get your hopes up. But if I were to start by saying, look, I want to build a Wraith list, I would start with certain commitments. I definitely need at least one Wraith Knight. I definitely need at least 18 Wraith Guard. I want at least a couple of Wraith Lords. And only after I have committed a bunch of points to this sort of narrative idea that includes a bunch of suboptimal units, do I actually start thinking about how I'm not going to lose the game horribly. And I think that is really the special sauce in casual list building, is to commit yourself to certain limiting factors at the beginning that will prevent you from building a competitive list. But once you've got maybe 1,000 to 1,200 points of models that have been included for narrative reasons, and you set yourself other limitations, maybe with reference to your craft world traits, your army-wide bonuses, then you do start thinking from a more competitive perspective. And this should create a list with nice balance, right? It's narrative, it tells a story, it has a theme, it definitely doesn't look like those, tournament-winning competitive lists. But at the same time, it's still teched out to play what is a competitive game that you win by scoring points, right? So that's the balance we're going to try to strike. Hopefully this will go well and be helpful to you. I'll see you at the table in a moment, but before we go there, if you're interested in this video, if you want to see more videos like this, or even if you just want to see more videos about competitive play, please click like, leave a comment. That'll encourage me to make more of this content. I'll see you in a minute. Okay, here we are at the table. So we're going to make a casual list together. And when I build a casual list, I usually either start with a thematic idea or with an idea about some units or some particular tactics that really don't make the grade for competitive play that nevertheless I want to use. But I think narrative lists, thematic lists are more fun. Usually when I build a list for casual play, that's where I start, is with some sort of thematic idea. So that's what I'm going to do today. And what I'm going to do is build a thematic Craft World Ibrasill list. So I'm an Ibrasill player. Craftworld Ibrasill is one of the lesser known craft worlds. Less than a page of information. It's been around for years. Nevertheless, GW has given us less than a page of information about who they are, what they're up to, what their priorities are, what their society's like. But what we have, I think, is very cool. And so I'm going to try to make an army that is consistent with my craft world. Now, if you're not an Ibrasill player and you're doing something like this, maybe if you play BL10 or something, maybe you want to make a list that's mostly aspect warriors and very aggressive. If you're an Yadam player, obviously you're going to want a lot of wraiths, especially big wraith constructs, right? If it's Samhain, you're going to want jet bikes. So this idea is probably not unfamiliar to any craft world player. But it's a little bit less straightforward if you play Ibrasill because they don't immediately have some sort of obvious thing in the way that these other more mainstream craft worlds do. So I'm going to start by telling you literally everything we know about craft world Ibrasill, and then we're going to work from that information towards what makes the most sense thematically for an army. So the first thing we know is that they're a predominantly matriarchal society. They have an above average number of female autarchs, as in like way more than half of them, because most of their population is female. More than half their population is female. We know that the most popular aspect warrior shrine is the Howling Banshee shrine, which makes sense also, right, from for obvious reasons. So the majority of their aspect warriors are Howling Banshees. So before I make any other decisions, actually, I'm just going to go ahead and put all of my Howling Banshees on the table. I need all of them because obviously I own 12. Well, I own 12 that are painted. Like all of you, I have lots of unpainted miniatures. But here are my 12 painted Howling Banshees ready to go. And I'm going to send them out in squads of 6 with... the Exarch has this glaive weapon called an Executioner. Now, I think that's a really good pick, insofar as there are good picks, but the only real reason that I'm running that instead of Mirror Swords is that that's what my Exarchs are modeled with. I have 2 with Executioners, so that's what we're doing. Here they are. I will make decisions later about Exarch powers, but I know I need all my Banshees. And I mentioned that the leadership is mostly female. I don't have any obviously female HQ models that aren't special characters that are, not necessarily craft worlders. But most of them could be. So here's a Farseer and a Warlock, both on jet bikes, because Ibrasill, I think, are very forward. They're very aggressive in their time. I mean, think about what Howling Banshees are like. They run at the enemy, shouting psychic screams fearlessly. So I imagine that they're very forward and aggressive in their play. So we'll put our psychers on jet bikes. Okay. So matriarchal society, female leadership, very aggressive. Banshees are a thing. The next thing we know about Craftworld Ibrasill is that they spend most of their time sending expeditions to the Crone Worlds in the Eye of Terror, trying to recover artifacts and also the Tears of Isha, which are, for all practical purposes, just soul stones. The stones that every Craftworld Eldari, the stone that every Craftworld Eldari carries, such that when she dies, instead of immediately being devoured by Slanesh, she who thirsts, which is tragically what happens to all of the Eldar when they die, unless you believe the Yunari, then they carry the soul stone so that their soul is stored in the soul stone and can be inserted into the infinity circuit of the craft world, and they live in this kind of collective ghost consciousness where they maintain their individuality, but it's certainly not anything like being alive. So they spend a lot of their time recovering artifacts and soul stones, and you'll actually, if you look at my table, it's partially visible in the frame, you'll notice that there are Eldari ruins everywhere, and that's because I specifically built this table because I am an Ibrasill player to be a Crone World. So what the Crone Worlds are, just in case you are a 40k newbie or maybe you're into the game but don't know a lot about the lore, when the old Eldari civilization fell over 10,000 years ago, the Eldar had the most powerful empire in the galaxy. Nobody could challenge them. And they were so unchallenged that they gave themselves over to luxury and eventually vice, Space elves feel everything much more deeply than human beings, and they live for a very long time, so they get bored and they have to come up with very original sins indeed to entertain themselves. And this culture of indulgence and extreme, violence and sexuality and satisfaction led to the birth of this new chaos god, Slaanesh, right? Whose birth scream sent out a psychic shockwave that completely obliterated Eldari civilization. And now that all that's left, aside from these ruins in the center of the Eye of Terror, the Eye of Terror is the hole in reality that Slaanesh's birth created. It's a place where real space and the warp overlap. So there are thousands of planets in the Eye of Terror, all of which, or almost all of which, used to be the center of the Eldari Empire, and now they are demon-haunted nightmarescapes of Eldari ruins and things that should not be crawling from the place within places, or crawling from the place between places. Excuse me. So Ibrasill is all about sending expeditions to the Crone Worlds, and the craft world itself, craft worlds are enormous world ships, is currently, in the current 40k timeline, positioned either in the Eye of Terror or just outside of it, depending on who you read. And this is their raison d'etre, right, to send out these expeditions. So as I make decisions about what goes into my list, I want to think about what sorts of units would appear in this kind of army. And although we haven't been told in the fluff any other particular unit favored by my craft world, Ibrasill, other than the Howling Banshees, I think it's reasonable to assume that a Wraith Knight belongs in this list, because Wraith Knights, we are told in the fluff, were constructed initially to be able to go toe-to-toe with incarnations of chaos gods and demon princes on Crone Worlds. And if Craftworld Ibrasill spends most of its time sending expeditions to Crone Worlds, then, and if they are mostly, if their vanguard is made up of aggressive Howling Banshees, it makes sense to suppose that these expeditions would have, in general, at least one Wraith Knight along with them. And I've gone for the melee build of the Wraith Knight because, again, if Howling Banshees are the order of the day, if that speaks to what their martial culture is like, then it makes sense that the Wraith Knight would be a melee Wraith Knight. Also, I will point out that the melee Wraith Knight is probably the most competitive of the Wraith Knight builds, but I'm not selling out because the Wraith Knight is definitely not a competitive model. I think it's actually probably arguably the worst Titanic model in 40k. It's hugely inefficient for its points. But right now, I'm not concerned about the rules or winning the game. What I'm doing is I'm building a thematic list. And so that's pretty much everything we know about the craft world. Matriarchal, Eye of Terror, Recover Relics, Howling Banshees. So now I have to make inferences. Before I add any other units, I'm going to commit to craft world traits. So I'm sure you know, craft world Ibrasill doesn't have rules of its own, and so I need to choose some custom craft world traits. And you might be thinking, I see what you're going to do, Brent. This is just you're saying it's a casual list, and you've put the Wraith Knight in there and some Banshees, which aren't competitive units, but you're about to take expert crafters, you sly dog and possibly immoral individual. No, I'm not going to take crafters because it's obvious that expert crafters was not intended for my craft world. If you look at the rules for those custom craft world traits, the fluff that is written before each rule in the name of each of those optional rules, it's just obvious that each of those, or I don't know if it's all of them, but of the lesser craft worlds that exist in the fluff, there are 2 custom craft world traits for each of them, clearly intended for particular lesser craft worlds. And expert crafters is not for Ibrasill. It's very obvious who it's for, and it's not for my space elves. My space elves are clearly intended to have hunters of ancient relics, which is pretty good. I already mentioned they spend all of their time hunting for ancient relics, exactly what it says in the fluff. And also children of Morag Hay. Now, this one, from a competitive standpoint, this is a bit more unfortunate because it is one of the worst custom craft world traits. Nevertheless, I'm going to take it because obviously I'm meant to have it if I'm running a thematic Ibrasill army. So here's how Children of Morag works. If at least half the models in a unit have been eliminated, all of the surviving models get +1 to hit. You can probably see why this is not great for Eldar. They're not really into losing models. They're a small elite army that tends to perform badly once they start dying, and so they're not a whole lot of units where this is. Also, typically when an Eldar unit starts taking casualties, usually it just dies. So it's pretty hard to get mileage out of this one, but I'm going to try. Hunters of Ancient Relics is pretty good. The way this one works is that if a unit is within 3 inches of an objective marker, it gets +1 to its attack's characteristics. So it's only for melee, but nevertheless, it can be a big damage multiplier. So for a unit like Shining Spears, or frankly my Howling Banshees, it increases the damage output of the unit by roughly 50% if they're on an objective. So that's pretty great. But it also tells me some things about how my army is supposed to play, or my craft world is supposed to play thematically. If they have Hunters of Ancient Relics and they're predominantly a Banshee-oriented martial culture, then obviously they're aggressive and melee-oriented. Clearly, it's why these 2 psychers are on jet bikes, right? I mentioned before, very clearly very aggressive, very melee-oriented. And I know from Children of Morag too that there's an implication here that they're accustomed to essentially suicidally aggressive tactics. So unit trading. I have to say, from a thematic perspective, I don't love this because I don't think that any craft world, especially one of the lesser craft worlds, but any craft world, Eldar are a dying race. Every Eldari life is key. It's very important. I don't think that any craft world probably can afford to take that approach, but that's currently what's in the fluff. I'm going to try to honor it. So I have two detachments that are starting to take shape on the table, right? This probably wants to be a battalion. And this is going to be a super heavy auxilia. And I'm going to, with both of these detachments, I'm going to take those 2 custom craft world traits. Now, Children of Morag does literally nothing for the Wraith Knight. It can't lose more than half the models in the unit. It would be ever so much better if I could swap that one out for Expert Crafters. But again, this is casual game, and I'm starting with some thematic limitations, so that's what I'm going with. But what I can do now is I can make inferences about what the rest of the army should be like thematically, and I can also start moving towards thinking about how I'm going to try to make this work such that I'm playing the game. I'm not just telling a story, and I'm not just going to lose flat out. So I think what I'm looking at is going to be an army that is going to play aggressive straight out of the gate, have a lot of melee units, and probably is going to engage in unit trading, right? That seems to be what Morag is all about. That, in theory, is part of the martial expectations, I guess, for Ibrasill in the field, is that they're very aggressive and they're willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for the good of the craft world. So as I add additional units here, I'm gonna think about those things. I feel like if you have a Wraith Knight in the army, and if your Space Elves are in the habit of getting themselves killed, if it's just part of their martial culture, then probably you've also got some Wraith Guard or Wraithblades, which are just undead Eldar. Now, I obviously am going to take Wraithblades because, A, they're better, but also because martial craft world and Hunters of Ancient Relics and Howling Banshees. If you were a Howling Banshee in life and you find yourself as a Wraith something or other in death, well, what are you going to be? You're going to have Ghost Swords, of course. The Axe and Shield build is more competitive. I sometimes use that in my competitive lists, but it just doesn't narratively here. I think the Ghost Swords make more sense, and also because I get to use those axes in my more competitive games, I'm going to seize upon this opportunity to run the Ghost Swords. And you'll notice that I've put 6 on the table. The reason that I've put 6 on the table is so that they have a good chance of making use of Children of Moria Heg, right? Because if I lose 3 of them, I have 3 that are benefiting from +1 to hit. Whereas if I were to run the minimum unit of 5, then I would have to lose 3 in order for 2 to benefit. Again, this is not a great competitive move, but I wanna honor the fluff. I want to try to make that Craft World trait work for me. I've already got 6 in my Howling Banshee squads, and with my Banshees, I put 6 on the table because that's literally how many I own, but it works out well there too, right? So I've got if 3 die, then I have 3 that are benefiting from the bonus. So I've got a lot of points on the table here. Before I start worrying about competitive play, I'm gonna or thinking about how I'm gonna not lose with this list, I'm gonna add a few more units. One, I'm gonna throw a Wave Serpent down because I need some way to deliver my Wraithblades to combat. They're slow on their own, so I'm gonna put a Wave Serpent next to my Wraith Knight here. I can fit all 6 of those Wraithblades in that Wave Serpent, and this is going to give me also some out-of-the-gate, tough, aggressive units that can immediately play for the midfield. And again, I think it fits both with the sort of tactical approach that's taking shape on the table, but also makes sense from a fluff perspective. And the other thing I have to have some Striking Scorpions. I just want them. I never get to use my Striking Scorpions. They're so bad. I think they're the worst unit in the Codex, but I love the models. I love the fluff. And I feel like in an army with a bunch of Banshees, their counterpart in some strange way is Scorpions. So I want some of those. And I'm going to add a unit of 6 Scorpions. Simply, again, Children of Moria Heg. And this is silly because Scorpions are unlikely to see combat. Yes, they can deep strike for free, but then they don't have any native bonus to their charge, so the odds of them actually getting into melee, often not so great. Usually we have them performing secondary missions. But again, right now I'm still thinking largely narratively, so I'm going to put 6 on the table to honor that fluff, and I'm going to give the Exarch the Claw. It's 10 points. I don't know if it's really worth it when they're not likely to fight, but that's what he's modeled with. And so that's what he's going to get. Now, I have 1,218 points on the table. I've done the math. That's what's there. At this point, I need to fill out my battalion, and I also start need to thinking about how I'm not going to lose horribly. There's always a balance, right? I think you're building a casual list between having something that tells a good story that's consistent, if you're doing a thematic one, that's consistent with the fluff, but also is really going to have some game. Because in a casual game, you want the game to be decided once you start playing, not before you start playing. That's one of the big differences between competitive and casual play. And if I just kept fluff building from here on in, I just kept throwing in units I never get to use, stuff that I think looks cool, I like the models, likely the game will be decided before we get to the table, and it will be decided against me, right? And so in the same way that it's not fun to play against a highly competitive player who's trying to win the game before it starts when you're just showing up with a casual list and want to have some fun and want the game to be decided at the table. Similarly, if you show up with a moderately competitive casual list that's got some game, and somebody else shows up with something that's just so fluffy that they have no chance at all, well, that's not the best. That's not the best outcome either. So I want to start thinking now about how I can make this work for me, while also continuing to add units that are consistent with the parameters that I've set for myself. That is, I'm going to favor Howling Banshees, which means I refuse to have more or even as many of any other aspect warrior as I have of those. And I want to honor this very aggressive style. So, for example, looking at this, I currently haven't used any heavy support slots. It might be tempting to try to work, say, 3 Fire Prisms in, because in a list that doesn't have expert crafters, Fire Prisms can be really valuable. They already re-roll with Linked Fire, the Linked Fire stratagem. They re-roll all of their to hit dice and all of their to wound dice, so they don't suffer from not having crafters. But I'm not going to do that because I don't think prisms just don't seem super Ibrasill to me. I want a more aggressive build. I can also start thinking about what Exarch powers I'm going to take, and I'm also going to start thinking about psychic powers. So based on what I'm looking at right now, what I think this list is going to do, and by the way, I'm not faking you out here. This is not a list I've ever run. I do build Ibrasill lists, thematic Ibrasill lists from time to time when I play casual games. I really like doing it. But this particular list, totally new. I've never run it before. And what I think is taking shape here, I have less than half my points left to work with, is an army that actually plays a little bit like Harlequins or Drukhari. So now I'm gonna ask myself, how am I gonna play the primary objective game? Because obviously the 40K is a game. It's not just storytelling. And it's very hard to win a game of 40K if you don't have strategies for how to play primary objectives. And I think what I'm looking at is an army that wants to play aggressively for the midfield, probably on turn 1 with the Wave Serpent full of Wraithblades and my Wraith Knight. And then if those units are destroyed or as they get swamped with other units, I want to be able to follow up that initial rush with other melee units, and maybe I'm just going to end up trading. So if you're playing something like Harlequins or Drukhari, often what happens is you wait for an opponent to jump onto an objective, and then you blow them off of it with a unit of Incubi or a unit of Harlequins with Kisses or something like that. And then that unit gets wiped out because Harlequins and Incubi are not very tough. But your opponent didn't get to score the objective. Ideally, you have something surviving on the objective that will get to score it, but you just keep unit trading in the midfield. And although, again, I think Craftworlders wouldn't normally be a big unit trading army, based on that second custom Craftworld power, it sounds like the designers were thinking that that's how Ibrasill would throw down. And so I'm going to try it. I'm going to try having this relatively durable first wave that's absolutely devastating, and if my opponent is able to engage them and tie them up or destroy them, then I can rush onto those objectives with my Banshees and hopefully clear out some chaff or do some damage. If I want my Banshees to be able to do some damage, I have to think about how I'm going to juice them up a bit, because on their own they're not great. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to opt for the Exarch power Piercing Strike instead of the War Shout that makes them -1 to hit in melee. The -1 to hit in melee thing kind of worked in 8th edition when you could also play lightning fast reflexes, and there were ways to get them to -2 to hit. Even then it wasn't great, but it's not enough to make them survivors. It's not enough to make them the tar pit unit that maybe they were originally intended to be in 8th edition, that they were going to run across the table and tag a tank and keep it from firing and be hard to get rid of. But that's just not how they play in 9th. So I'm going to give them Piercing Strike instead. I'm going to sacrifice a little durability. They have so little anyway. I think it doesn't really matter. And what Piercing Strike does is it reduces the attack characteristic of the Exarch by 1, but instead of this glaive weapon doing D3 damage, now it does flat 3 damage. And so because I have that Hunters of Ancient Relics secondary or custom Craftworld trait, it's really a wash if I'm doing this on an objective, because an Exarch has 3 attacks natively, so 4 attacks on an objective with Hunters of Ancient Relics, and now we're back down to 3 because of Piercing Strike. But that ability to do flat 3 damage, that means I can just straight up kill Custodes, kill Terminators, take out a Tyranid Warrior, maybe put the final hurt on some monstrous unit or even tank that I need to take it off the board, right? So it gives my Banshees a little bit more punch. When I run Banshees, I often use Piercing Strike. It works better when you have expert crafters, because then you can use the reroll on the Exarch, and you're much more likely to get that hit. But nevertheless, my striking Scorpions, I'm going to sit tight on them for now. I think what they're going to be doing for me is helping me play secondary objectives, and right now I'm thinking about primaries. So I'm going to ignore them. I'm not going to decide on their exarch power right this minute. I'm going to start thinking about how I can keep going with this idea that I'm going to contest the midfield very aggressively. And I think the next step for that is to think about other units that can make use of Hunters of Ancient Relics and also fill that role where they're blasting. Every time my opponent tries to get onto an objective, I'm going to blast her off of the objective. So I'm going to add some Shining Spears. Now, yes, Shining Spears are a competitive unit, and this is a casual list, but it's not the case that just because you're running a casual list, you can't have any competitive units. I sometimes run into players who are sort of determined to only put the worst units in their codex in their casual list, and then they're disappointed when they lose all their games. But I think that a casual list is not a list that doesn't contain any competitive units. It's just a list that's not first and foremost optimized for the win. So I'm going to add 2 squads of 4 spears. And I'm going to give the Exarch model the upgraded lance. And here's why I'm doing 4s. Normally if I'm running spears in a list, I'll often run two up 6s, but I want to stick by the narrative commitment that I made at the beginning of the game to have more Banshees than anything else. So I'm going to run fewer spears. It's also a little bit more points efficient, because with Hunters of Ancient Relics, I'm increasing the damage output of these spears by about 50%. Again, it's kind of a bummer not to have expert crafters, but it's enough that they can punch pretty much any enemy unit off of an objective. Oh no, I don't have a... Okay, well, it turns out I didn't bring down enough spears. I am not going to take off the headphones and run upstairs and get another spear. You can just imagine a 4th spear in this other squad. But I think that the spears with this Hunters of Ancient Relic build are gonna be tough enough in groups of 4, powerful enough in groups of 4, potent enough to fill that objective clearing purpose. If I need them to, they can potentially do something else, jump some other unit that's not on an objective, but they're going to have 50% more damage output that way, and that'll offset, again, the small squad. Before I make a decision about Exarch powers, I have to decide whether or not I'm going to deep strike them. And I think I'm going to. So I'm going to plan on starting both units of Shining Spears in deep strike, which means I'm going to want to give Swooping Dive to the Exarchs, which gives them a +1 bonus to charge out of deep strike. And it also means it's going to start answering the question, what psychic powers should I have? My Warlock is going to trade out his smite power. Never take smite with the Warlock. They have a Warlock smite of 1. That's baby smite, right? And the runes of fortune powers are really good. So I often like Fateful Divergence. It's like mini expert crafters. It would be really good in this list because potentially I could give a reroll to my Wraith Knight, but I think I'm going to do Ghost Walk instead, and that will enable me to give a deep striking unit of spears +2 to charge. And so if they get +1 from having the Exarch and +2 from that very easy to cast Warlock power, now they've got a +3. They only need to roll a 6 on 2 dice. If I have a reroll in my back pocket, they're very likely to succeed on the charge. So that's what I'm going to do with the spears. They're going to start in deep strike. There is a command point cost to this because I've already got a Wraith Knight in the list, and starting 2 units of deep strike is not super cheap. So I'm going to have to think carefully about command points when I get to the end. I better add some troop units. I've got to fill my battalion out, and I'm running out of points here. So what am I going to do? I still, even though at this point I'm thinking about how I'm not going to lose the game terribly, I still want to make sure that I'm giving some play to units that don't normally get a lot of play. And because Ibrasill is a very melee-oriented army, I want to use Storm Guardians. So I've got a shelf behind me here. I'm going to add in some Storm Guardians. Storm Guardians are the the Eldar Guardians that come with either Eldari swords or chain swords. The chain sword is just objectively better because it allows you to roll an extra attack die, whereas with the Eldari blade, you only get that extra attack die if you miss the first time. And to try to give them some play, yeah, I'm gonna add a couple fusion guns. So I just put one down. So I have 2 fusion guns. The fusion gun, of course, is essentially a bright lance, but only at close range. So what are they going to do? They can put some pressure on the midfield. The fusion gun is dangerous. Now, ideally, I would deep strike them with the 2 fusion guns. Ideally, I would deep strike them. But I've just given all of my deep striking potential over to my jet bikes, because you have to choose between deep striking some infantry units or deep striking some jet bike units. If you read the stratagems, that's how it shakes out. And I don't have a transport to put them in. Also, I wouldn't want to waste a transport on some Storm Guardians. So that's another narrative decision. Maybe not the smartest move, but again, I think it's very appropriate. I think an Ibrasill, Craftworld Ibrasill army would definitely have some melee-oriented troops, at least one melee-oriented troop unit. And you'll notice that I have about half of them built with chainswords and half of them built with the Eldari blades, and that's not a tactical choice. As I said, the chainswords are just better. It's just they only give you in the upgrade pack 2 chainswords. I even cannibalized ones from some Necromunda Eschers. But again, because this is casual play, I'm going to run I'm going to be honest about the Eldari blades just being Eldari blades. I'm not going to try to say that they're chainswords. And I'm going to have a unit that can either sit on a backfield objective or march up to the midfield, lay down some fire with those fusion guns, probably just get shot off the board. But I'm going to live with that. I'm going to add some Dire Avengers, a minimum unit of Dire Avengers. I'm not building this one out to the 6 to try to take advantage of Children of Moriheg because I'm running out of points, and they're just going to stick with their standard Exarch Power Battle Fortune. It gives them a little extra durability. I'm going to need some troops units with objective secured to help with objective control, and I think that's what they're going to do. There's no opportunity to deep strike them if I'm deep striking those jet bikes. And as I make decisions about my final points, I have to think about gaps in my plan. So I have an idea about how I'm going to play primary objectives. I'm going to rush the midfield. I have some troops units here that can hold the objective in my own backfield. And now I have to think a bit about secondaries. Well, my standard secondaries with Eldar are engage on all fronts and scramblers, and that'll work for this list because my Scorpions can deep strike. If they're not fighting, they can perform scramblers. My Dire Avengers can perform scramblers in my own deployment zone on turn 1, so I should have no problem pulling off scramblers. But nevertheless, if everything is focused on the middle of the board and melee, you may remember that engage on all fronts doesn't count unless you're wholly within the board quarter and not near the center of the board. I think it might be 12 inches, maybe it's 9 inches from the center of the board. But if you're near the center of the table, or if you're spread out into 2 different quadrants, you don't count. That unit doesn't count for controlling either of them. Engage on all fronts requires me to have a unit wholly within at least 3 quadrants of the board at the end of my turn and not in the center of the table to score 2 points, or all 4 quadrants to score 4. And I want to make sure that I can score some real points on this. So for my 3rd troop unit, because I'm worried that my Banshees and my Wraithblades and my Wraith Knight and my deep striking Shining Spears, they all have to make decisions about where they need to be based on what they need to fight. And so they may not, even though I've got some fast units here, they really might not be good candidates for engage on all fronts. And so I'm gonna for my 3rd troop unit, I'm gonna add some Rangers. Now, we all know that Rangers are not great. They got nerfed hardcore in 9th. But I don't need them to do anything except help me score engage on all fronts, maybe perform scramblers once. Hey, if they deal a mortal wound with one of those sniper rifles they carry around, that's great, but I'm not going to count on it because that's not what they're there for. But I think I can reliably get up to probably maybe 14 points with engage on all fronts. If I'm scoring 2 on the first turn and then 3 on the other turns with the scorpions and the scouts, and I can get to the 10 with scramblers. For my third, it's not obvious what my third secondary should be, but what is obvious is that I don't have enough heavy support fire. So far I haven't included any heavy support units. I still have about 300 points left, and I need some heavy support. I'm going to have a difficult time dealing with hard targets or heavy infantry at range. And so what I'm going to do, I could do Wraith Knights, or Wraith Lords, excuse me, which would make sense narratively. A Wraith Seer could be cool because it would give me some more psychic play. And also, I want target saturation, right? Because I'm going to, if turn 1, I can't hide a Wraith Knight. So the Wraith Knight's going to be vulnerable to fire turn 1. I can try to keep it alive by moving it around with Phantasm in the deployment phase, and maybe on the first turn put it out of range of most of my opponent's heavy weapons. But I think there's no way around the fact that after I've taken my turn, both my Wave Serpent and my Wraith Knight are likely to be soaking up heavy fire. So as I make a heavy support choice, I also want to put something on the table that's going to add target diversity while also solving the problem that I don't have enough powerful anti either heavy infantry or heavy target firepower. So what I'm going to do, here, okay, I'm going to do a pair of falcons, and I'm going to give them bright lances. That's the right move. And the reason that I'm going to do this is I can start those 6 elf units of banshees in the falcons. I'll put the lances on later. In the falcons, because there's also a possibility, right? If I just start the Banshees out of line of sight in my own deployment zone, my opponent gets first turn, maybe she has a powerful indirect fire weapon, or maybe she has some flyer that zips into my deployment zone turn 1 and just lights up my infantry with a heavy bolter or something. I don't want that to happen. And my Banshees have to do some work for me, right? They're the narrative all-stars of this list. So I'm going to put 6 Banshees in each of the Falcons. This is pretty good. So I can start the Falcons out of line of sight, and then on turn 1, I can move them towards the midfield such that the Banshees are going to be in range turn 2, because they can both advance and charge, to mug something on an objective or hit some vulnerable, heavy weapons unit or something. But they're also going to provide... I suspect that my opponent is going to target my Wraith Knight and my Wave Serpent. So I think the Falcons will probably be relatively safe on turn 1. And one of those Falcons, if there's a objective in my own deployment zone, or quite close to my own deployment zone, I currently don't have anything that wants to hang back except for my infantry to cover my own objective. So I can take a Falcon, put it maybe 2.5 inches in front of an objective. It can control that objective. There can be some infantry behind it in case it gets destroyed, but it'll give me some extra play on that objective. The Bright Lance and the Pulse Laser can lay down heavy fire at long range, and then on the next turn, when I deploy my Banshees, they can deploy 3 inches forward of that tank. That'll put them close enough to the midfield. The other one can do whatever it needs to do. Seems pretty good. That leaves me... Let's see, I've got unit values over here. That leaves me 26 points. So I could, at this point, upgrade the weapons on my Wave Serpent. I don't love doing that because Serpents need to make an advance move first turn, so they typically want assault weapons. You can give them a targeting matrix. But the other thing is they tend to take so much damage so fast that their weapon profile degrades. It's the same reason that I don't love the idea of shoulder-mounted weapons on the Wraith Knight. If he survives first turn, he's going to have a degraded profile, and he's definitely wants to make an advance move first turn, so the only thing I would put on there is an assault weapon. Shuriken cannons just aren't that great, especially if they're suffering a penalty to hit. And so I'm going to give Spirit Stones to the Falcons to give them a little bit of extra durability, to give them that 6-up feel no pain. And in order to increase the durability of the Wraith Knight, I've got to make some decisions about psychic powers. I'm already committed to the Warlock having Ghost Walk in order to help my Shining Spears Deep Strike effectively and actually get into combat. But I think that my Farseer is going to take Fortune. I think anytime you run a Wraith Knight, you want Fortune. So you can put that 5-up Feel No Pain on the Wraith Knight to try to keep it on the board a little bit longer so it actually has some play. And then, although it's tempting to take Executioner, I think I have to take Doom. And the reason that I have to take Doom is, even though I have the Pulse Lasers at Strength 8 that do flat 3 damage, and I have the Bright Lances now on the Falcons at Strength 8 that do D6 damage, and I have some fusion guns over here, I still just don't have enough heavy weapons at range to threaten really hard targets. Yes, this big Ghost Glaive here does flat 6 damage, but it's pretty hard to get your Wraith Knight into combat with anything that where flat 6 damage is what is hugely valuable, because anything that's really vulnerable to that is probably going to avoid the Wraith Knight. My Shining Spears, flat 2 damage, they have enough attacks, certainly on an objective. The Exarch has the Star Lance, which is Strength 8, flat 2 damage. We've got some play, but I think I have to have Doom, because I need for some of my other weapons to be able to threaten harder targets. So we're going to take Doom and Fortune and Smite with the Farseer. And my Warlock, I should probably take Protect Jinx, because it's a good way to deal with invulnerable saves, but I'm not going to. I'm going to make a narrative decision here. I'm going to take Empower, Enervate, because I want to see my Howling Banshees do some work, right? Empower gives you +1 to wound. And so now these Strength 4 models, I think it's Strength 5 for the Exarch, are batting 1 above. So now instead of wounding, say, Space Marines on a 4-up, they wound Space Marines on a 3-up, or the Exarch would do it on a 2-up, and then that flat 3 damage with Piercing Strike could really be effective. And if the Banshees aren't good candidates for Empower, then the Spears potentially will be good candidates for Empower. Empower can be really effective on Spears. So that leaves me with 6 points, and I don't know what to do with 6 points, so I'm going to go ahead and give... I'm going to give my Farseer the Singing Spear. I never do this. In fact, I think I said in my video on our best units and how to use them, never give the Farseer the Singing Spear. Well, I have 6 points left. It's a casual game. I don't know what to do, so I'm going to give the Singing Spear is basically just like the Witchblade, but it has a 12. You can shoot with it. It has a 12-inch range. It automatically wounds on a 2-up. He hits on a 2-up, but then it has no. It does D3 damage, but it has no AP, and that's why it's generally not a great pick. Okay, so I've got my army here. I've got 1 point left. I can't spend 1 point. It looks pretty good for casual play, but what I'm going to do now is an audit. I'm going to make sure I have secondaries in mind, a way to play the primary objective game. I haven't left any big gaps in my list, and I want to make sure that I have enough resources to power this whole engine doing what it needs to do. So I've already talked about my primary objective plan. I think that's pretty solid. I won't say anything else about that. Secondaries, I have Engage on All Fronts and Scramblers for sure. My third objective is tougher, because I don't have enough Psychers to choose a Psychic one. I don't have anything that's likely enough to remain alive to do While We Stand, We Fight. So I think what I'm going to count on is one of the objective-based secondaries, because this is a list that is going to want to dominate objectives. Eldar are not good at this. It's probably not a great idea to double down on this, but I'm going to plan on doing that unless my opponent shows up to the table with something in her list that is just an obvious target for, say, Bring It Down, right? If she shows up with a bunch of vehicles that are going to rush the midfield and I think that I can take them out, then maybe I'll take Bring It Down. And for competitive play, having 2 secondaries that I was confident I could get to a good score on really wouldn't be sufficient. But this is a casual game, and so I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to assume that 2 is good enough. Now I want to make sure I'm not getting totally stomped by any particular build. Well, do I have a way to deal with heavy infantry? Yeah, my Shining Spears can deal with heavy infantry. My Ghost Warriors here, even though they're flat 1 damage, they have such a high number of attacks and damage output that they can do it. My Piercing Strike, I have my Pulse Lasers, those fire a couple shots and do flat 3 damage. I can deal with heavy infantry. I have some game against it. Can I deal with hordes? Well, I've got a lot of shuriken fire on my bikes. These Ghost Swords just go through hordes like nothing. Howling Banshees actually have really good play against hordes. I've got some other small arms fire here. I'm not going to count on my Storm Guardians doing anything, but if they do, great. So I've got some play against hordes. I can rush a gun line, no problem. Gun line, I'll be in their face. Easy. Against a melee army, great. That's what I want. I want to slug it out in melee. I want to initiate the attack, but I can do that. What if I come up against really good invulnerable saves? Well, I'm going to have to rely on volume of attacks. These guys have volume of attacks. Hunters of Ancient Relics will give me volume of attacks. So I don't have any obvious shortcomings against any particular types of build that I'm likely to come up against. I have a plan for the primary objectives. I have a plan for the secondary objectives. Now I need to make sure that I've planned such that nobody needs something that they're not going to have access to because someone else is competing for the same stratagem on the same turn. And I think I'm good. I haven't overused. I don't have a ton of command points because I have 2 units in Deep Strike and I have that Wraith over there, but I also don't have any units that really demand a lot of command points. I can use Fire and Fade for a point on my Falcons to move them out of line of sight if necessary, or to get my Shining Spears a little bit closer, or to get even my Wave Serpent a little bit closer so that my Ghost Soldiers can jump out next turn. I'm going to probably use Supreme Disdain a lot, right? Generates extra hit on 6s. My Banshees are going to love using Supreme Disdain. Probably also my Ghost Warriors will love using Supreme Disdain, but that's not super expensive. If I have a bunch of command points that are burning a hole in my pocket, I can use Tears of Isha on my Wraith Knight to regenerate lost wounds. Definitely worth doing if you can get that enormous Ghost Bot up to a better profile, right? So if the profile has started to degrade and getting D3 wounds back gives you a chance to get back to that first profile, it's obviously worth doing. So I don't have a big command point deficit that's going to be problematic for me. So let's see, I don't have a relic. I'm going to take the Warlord trait, Seer of the Shifting Vector, because that's what you do when you don't know what else to do. It'll give my Farseer rerolls for Doom and also for Fortune. I'm really counting on those going off. I can use Seer Council with my Psychers to make psychic casts more likely. And when I have a relic that I don't know what to do with, I give a Phoenix Gem to the Warlock so he can do a suicide run, or she. We're going to assume that both of our HQs are female because Ibrasill can do a suicide run late game if necessary. Okay, there it is. Yeah, I think that's a pretty solid force for casual play. And you'll see that what I did was I started with a narrative plan or a narrative idea. I honored the narrative to create parameters for myself. I put units on the table that are consistent with my fluff, and I chose craft world traits not based on what's competitive, but based on what's appropriate to my army. And only once I'd spent 1,200 points did I start thinking seriously about how I was going to try to win the game, right? And I think that's really where casual list building and competitive list building are different. In competitive list building, you're thinking from the very beginning about how you're going to win the game. And also your threshold for what's acceptable is going to be lower. So in a competitive list, only knowing what 2 secondary missions I was going to favor, right, where I felt like I had good play, that would be completely unacceptable, right? Having a third secondary that's picked at the last minute is likely to lose you the game in a close competitive game. But for casual play, it's fine. Now, when it actually comes time to pilot this army at the table, let's say I show up to my game and it's a casual game and I'm across the table from somebody who has also brought a casual list, but it's even more casual than mine. They are opening at the table. This person is opening the munitions or the grand tournament book and looking at secondary missions. And not only it's fine to like pick your secondary missions when you arrive. Like that's no problem. It's often smart to pick them based on what your opponent brings. But let's imagine that this is a situation where it's very obvious that this person is not familiar with them. Like really has not thought about this at all. At this point, if I see this happening, the casual games are supposed to be decided at the table, right? While you're playing, not before the game. And if I look at the game and I realize I'm going to win, definitely, because this person is sloppily choosing secondaries, I think that the sporting thing to do is to change my mind about my secondaries, right? So if it looks like I am well stacked against this other army, instead I'm going to choose secondaries that are tough. Maybe I'm going to choose one of the psychic secondaries. So mental interrogation is cool, and the way that works is you make a psychic test. I think it's difficulty 4 against a nearby enemy character. If you succeed, you automatically score 3 points, I think, every time you succeed. It's really powerful. It's very easy to pull off, but the cost, of course, is that the other person has an opportunity to deny the witch, and also that psyker then is not doing any psychic casts, and that can be a real problem. But that could be interesting. Something like cut off the head, where you have to assassinate the enemy warlord, that's something that really only ever has competitive possibility in 500-point play. It could be very easy in 500-point play to kill an enemy warlord. It's really not great in Strike Force level play, but maybe, right, if my opponent is kind of waffling at the table, doesn't really have a plan, and it looks like the game will not be close if I don't switch my secondaries up, maybe that's what I want to do. So I think that, again, when we build a casual list, we're going for a balance of sort of maybe unusual tactical ideas or strategic ideas, and or a thematic approach. And then you can tool your casual list up or down with the secondaries that you choose, in particular based on who's showing up to the game, so that both players stand the best possible chance of having a good time at the table, having the game decided after you've started playing by the decisions you make. Even in casual play, I feel very strongly that games are more fun when they're not decided by the dice or by who has the stronger codex, but by players' decisions at the table. So by all means, once the game starts, like that person who showed up waffling about what secondaries to pick, once the game starts, try to win, right? Don't just you're not under any sort of obligation to play badly or anything. But I do think that anything you can do on the front end to make sure that the game isn't predetermined is A, will make everybody have more fun, and B, is just more consistent with the whole concept of casual play. So I don't know, maybe I'll give this list a whirl and let you all know how it went. I'm actually kind of excited to try it now. It looks like a good time. But I think, regardless of how it goes, the next time I make a video, I'll go back to making videos about competitive play. The next one I think is going to be part 2 of how to build an Eldar army list. You saw me at the very end of building this list do a quick list audit. Part of what I'm going to do is a deep dive on what it means to do a list audit, how you do that when you're really serious about it for competitive play, and not just when you're making sure you're closing loopholes in your list for a casual game. So that's it for today, guys. Thanks so much. Please, if you've not already done so, like this video if you liked it, leave a comment below, and maybe share it with a friend if you know somebody who would be interested. Thanks. Good night.